I still remember the summer of 2009 when I decided to drive out to the Ozark National Forest in Arkansas for a weekend camping trip. I was 27 at the time, working long hours at a warehouse job, and I needed a break from the constant noise of machines and fluorescent lights. I didn't want company. I wanted silence, just me, my gear, and the woods. I packed light, just a small tent, a sleeping bag, a cooler with some food, a small propane stove, and a lantern. The drive itself was long, winding through stretches of highway that became thinner the deeper I went into the forest. By the time I reached the gravel road leading into the campsite, I hadn't seen another vehicle for at least an hour. The area I picked wasn't an official campsite. It was more of a clearing I had found while checking maps the night before. No amenities, no people, no lights. That was the point. I parked my old Ford pickup on the edge of the clearing and began unloading my gear. The ground was damp from rain the night before, the air heavy with that wet earth smell that clings to your clothes. Setting up the tent was quick. I laid out my sleeping bag, stashed my cooler nearby, and gathered enough wood for a small fire. The sun was dipping behind the trees by the time I sat down in front of the flames, the sky fading to that deep blue right before full darkness. First, the night was peaceful. The forest came alive with sounds: crickets, frogs, and the occasional owl. The kind of sounds that normally ease you into sleep. But as the hours dragged on, I noticed a change. It was subtle, but the natural chorus quieted. The frogs stopped croaking. The crickets slowed down. Even the air felt different, colder, like a chill had settled over the clearing. I told myself it was nothing. Animals go quiet for all sorts of reasons. Still, the silence gnawed at me. I tried to focus on cooking dinner, just some sausages I had brought in a pack. As the grease hissed on the pan, I thought I heard something behind me. A faint crunch like a foot pressing into leaves. I turned, lantern raised, but all I saw were trees stacked tightly together, their trunks disappearing into the dark. I stood there longer than I should have, watching, waiting for some movement. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just my nerves. I sat back down and ate quickly, barely tasting the food. By 10 o'clock, I decided to get some rest. I put out the fire, zipped myself inside the tent, and lay back on my sleeping bag. The forest remained eerily quiet. Every tiny sound from outside carried sharp and clear, something brushing against a branch, the faint rustle of leaves. I kept telling myself it was deer, maybe raccoons nosing around. But then, maybe an hour after lying down, I heard it again, that distinct crunch of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, not the random scuttle of an animal. One step, then a pause, another step. My chest tightened, and I held my breath. Whoever it was, or whatever it was, stopped just outside the thin layer of nylon that separated me from the night. I stared at the shape of the tent's wall, waiting to see a shadow. Nothing, just silence again. I didn't move for what felt like forever. My mind kept spinning. Maybe it was a hunter, maybe someone just stumbled on my camp, but no one hikes this deep in at night without a light. I would have seen a flashlight. I finally worked up the courage to unzip the tent a couple inches. The clearing was pitch black except for the faint glow of embers in the fire pit. No movement, no sound. I closed the zipper slowly and forced myself to stay awake, clutching the small hatchet I kept near the tent flap. Sometime past midnight, exhaustion won. I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember was waking to another sound. This time it wasn't footsteps. It was metal, a faint clink, like something brushing against the bed of my truck. I shot up, my heart hammering in my chest. I pressed my ear against the tent fabric and listened hard. The sound came again, clearer, something metallic shifting. My cooler was in the bed of the truck. Someone was going through it. I slipped out of the tent as quietly as I could, hatchet in hand. My bare feet sank into the damp ground, the night air biting against my skin. I crouched low, trying not to breathe too loud, and inched toward the truck. When I finally had a clear line of sight, I froze. There was a man standing by my pickup. He wasn't a camper. He wasn't dressed for the woods. His clothes were ragged, filthy, like he'd been living rough for weeks. His hair was wild, face hidden in shadow, but I could see enough to know he wasn't there by accident. He was pulling things out of my cooler, examining them, tossing aside what he didn't want. He moved slow, casual, like he had all the time in the world. I stayed crouched, barely daring to blink. My first thought was to yell, to let him know I was there, but instinct told me not to. Something about him felt wrong, dangerous. He wasn't just stealing food, he was too calm, too deliberate, like he was testing how much he could get away with. After a few minutes, he picked up one of my water bottles, twisted the cap, and drank half of it before setting it back in the bed of the truck. Then he turned his head slightly, like he had heard something. My blood ran cold. Even in the dark, I felt his eyes scanning the clearing. He didn't call out, didn't move fast, just looked around for a long time before returning to rummaging. I backed away slowly, careful not to snap a twig. My only thought was getting inside the truck and driving out. But the keys were in my backpack, inside the tent, only a few feet from where he stood. If I went for them, he would see me. I hid behind a tree and waited. Minutes dragged on like hours. Finally, he finished digging through the cooler. He didn't take much. Just a couple sausages wrapped in foil and another bottle of water. Then, without a word, he slung the food under his arm and walked into the woods. No flashlight, no stumbling. He moved like he knew the place by heart. Within seconds, he was gone, swallowed by the darkness. I stayed frozen until I couldn't hear him anymore. My legs ached from crouching, but I didn't dare move. The forest was silent again, not even a breeze in the leaves. When I finally gathered enough courage, I ran to the tent, grabbed my backpack, and sprinted for the truck. I slammed the door shut, jammed the key into the ignition, and started the engine. The sound roared through the clearing, breaking the silence, but I didn't care. I drove out fast, gravel spitting out from under the tires, not looking back once. I didn't stop until I hit a gas station off the highway nearly 2 hours later. I parked under the bright fluorescent lights and just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, trying to catch my breath. My cooler was half empty, my nerves wrecked, but I was alive. That night taught me something I never forgot. Out in the woods, the scariest thing isn't bears or wolves or storms. It's people. People who don't belong there. People who wait for the silence to fall before stepping into it. I never went camping alone again. I never thought I'd say yes when my boss suggested we go camping together. It was 2016, and I was 27 at the time, working at a construction supply company in northern Colorado. My boss, Tom, was in his early 40s, one of those guys who thought bonding with his employees outside of work made for a better work environment. I didn't really have an excuse to say no when he asked if I wanted to tag along for a weekend trip. He had already arranged the spot, packed most of the gear, and even had a truck ready. I figured it might be weird, but maybe it would help me keep my job safe. We drove out early on a Saturday morning. Tom's truck rattled with every bump on the dirt road as we headed further into the foothills. The air smelled clean, the kind of sharp mountain air you only get far from town. It was late September, cool in the mornings but still warm during the day. The trees were already turning shades of orange and red, and every so often I'd catch the scent of pine mixed with the dusty gravel road. I didn't know much about camping, but Tom looked like he'd done it 100 times. He had this beat-up old cooler, a heavy canvas tent, a propane stove, and even an axe tied down in the bed of the truck. We reached the campsite after an hour of driving down roads that got smaller and rougher until it was barely just two tire ruts through grass and dirt. Tom parked near a clearing at the edge of the tree line. It wasn't a marked campground, just open forest land, which made me nervous. I'd only ever camped once as a kid in a proper campground with bathrooms and other families nearby. This was different, remote, too quiet. The spot itself was flat, with tall grass in patches and a fire ring someone had made from big rocks years ago. The trees surrounded us thick on three sides, and the fourth opened to a slow slope that looked down over a wide stretch of dark green forest. You could see for miles, no houses, no roads, just wilderness. We got out, stretched, and started unloading. The tent was heavy and awkward to put up, but Tom was used to it. He hammered the stakes into the ground with the flat side of his axe while I held the fabric tight. My hands were already raw from pulling the straps, and the smell of old canvas stuck in my nose. Once the tent was up, we built a fire, stacking wood Tom had brought from home in a neat pile near the pit. The first half of the day was almost enjoyable. We ate sandwiches sitting on folding chairs, listening to the wind through the branches. I could hear the distant rush of a stream somewhere downhill. I tried to relax, but the silence was heavier than I expected. No cars, no people, not even the usual city background noise. Just wind, the occasional crack of a branch, and my own heartbeat in my ears. As the sun started sinking behind the ridge, the temperature dropped fast. Shadows stretched long across the clearing. I pulled my jacket tighter and watched the sky turn pink, then deep purple. Tom cracked open a beer, tossed me one, and we sat by the fire. The flames snapped and spit sparks, and the smell of smoke clung to my clothes. It was sometime after dark when I first started feeling uneasy. Not scared, just unsettled. The woods around us seemed to close in as the firelight flickered. My ears kept catching noises, twigs snapping, dry leaves shifting, but every time I turned my head, there was nothing. I told myself it was animals, probably deer, maybe raccoons. Nothing unusual, but the sounds didn't stop. They kept coming, spaced apart, like something moving slowly, deliberately. Tom didn't seem to notice. He leaned back in his chair, boots stretched toward the fire, sipping his beer like he had no care in the world. Meanwhile, my eyes kept scanning the tree line. Every dark gap between branches looked like it was hiding something. Around midnight, after we'd put out most of the fire, we crawled into the tent. The inside smelled of dirt and old fabric. My sleeping bag crinkled as I climbed in, and the thin mat underneath didn't do much against the hard ground. Tom fell asleep almost immediately, his breathing heavy and steady. But I couldn't sleep. The noises outside were louder now. The crunch of something walking in the grass. The shift of weight like boots pressing into soil. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I held my breath, straining to listen. It wasn't random. It was footsteps, slow, careful, circling the tent. I stared at the thin nylon walls, knowing that whoever or whatever was out there could easily tear through them. The sound stopped right by my side of the tent. Just silence. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. After what felt like an hour, the steps faded away into the trees. I lay there, rigid, until exhaustion finally pulled me into a restless sleep. When I woke up, it was still dark, but lighter, the faint glow of early dawn creeping in. Tom was still asleep, snoring. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and stepped outside. The ground was damp, the air biting cold. My breath fogged in front of me. That's when I saw them, footprints in the dirt. Not animal tracks, not boots like ours. Bare feet, long, wide impressions pressed deep into the soil, circling the tent in a slow loop. Some came close, just inches from where my head had been lying inside. I froze, staring at them. They led off into the trees, fading into the undergrowth. My stomach dropped, and I felt sick. Someone had been there watching us. Standing there in the middle of nowhere with my skin crawling, I realized how vulnerable we had been. No locks, no neighbors, no phone signal. Just us and whoever else was out there. I didn't wake Tom right away. I just kept looking at those tracks, following them with my eyes until they disappeared into the woods. The feeling of being watched clung to me, heavier than the cold air. I finally went back inside, shook Tom awake, and told him we needed to pack up. He looked confused, but when he came out and saw the tracks, his face went pale. We tore down the tent in silence. My hands shook as I shoved the fabric into the bag. Every sound from the trees made me whip my head around. I half expected to see someone step out from behind a trunk, just standing there. But no one came. The drive back was quiet. Tom didn't make small talk like he usually did. He just kept his eyes on the road, jaw tight. I stared out the window, trying not to think about the fact that someone had walked barefoot through those woods in the middle of the night and circled our camp. When I got home, I dropped my bag on the floor and sat down, still in my smoke-stained clothes, and tried to shake the feeling off. But I couldn't. I kept picturing those footprints in the dirt, the way they stopped right next to where I'd been lying. I never went camping again after that, and I never looked at Tom the same way either. At work, he sometimes brought up the trip, but neither of us mentioned the footprints. It was like an unspoken agreement, but I could see it in his face. He hadn't forgotten either. It's been years now, but every once in a while, I wake up at night and hear faint footsteps in my head, circling. And I still wonder who was out there that night, barefoot in the cold, and what they wanted. I was 23 years old in the summer of 2014 when I made the mistake of camping in a graveyard. It wasn't some childish dare or ghost hunting trip. It was just me being careless and stubborn. I was traveling through upstate New York with nothing more than a backpack, a small tent, and the mindset of saving money wherever I could. Campgrounds were crowded and overpriced, and sleeping on the side of the road made me nervous. So when I came across a small, half-forgotten graveyard behind a line of trees near a quiet rural road, I convinced myself it was the perfect spot to stay for the night. The graveyard looked old, probably dating back to the 1800s. The headstones leaned and cracked, names and dates worn away by time and weather. Some were broken in half, others tilted so much they looked like they would topple with one strong gust of wind. Grass had grown tall around the stones, and thorny weeds wrapped themselves around the bases. The place didn't look cared for, just left there, swallowed by nature. I set up my tent near the edge, close to a cluster of maple trees that bordered the stone wall. The wall itself was barely 3 feet tall, stones piled loosely together, moss growing in the cracks. I figured nobody would come out here at night, and it was far enough from the road that passing cars wouldn't notice me. By the time I had my tent pitched and sleeping bag rolled out, the sun was already dipping behind the trees. The sky went from orange to a dull gray, and the air grew cooler fast. It had been a hot day, but the night air in those woods carried a chill that felt sharper than it should. I cooked a small meal on my camp stove, just rice and beans, and sat against one of the big maples while I ate. The place was quiet, too quiet. Out in the woods, you expect to hear crickets, frogs, maybe the distant call of an owl, but the graveyard seemed to swallow sound. The only thing I could hear was the faint rustle of leaves overhead. When darkness finally took over, I climbed into the tent with my flashlight and tried to read a paperback I had brought along. I lasted maybe 10 minutes before I gave up. My focus wasn't there. Every time I heard something outside, twigs snapping, leaves crunching, I found myself freezing up, waiting for it to happen again. At first, I told myself it was just animals, a raccoon, maybe a deer moving through the brush. Nothing unusual, but the sounds didn't feel random. They seemed spaced apart, deliberate, like footsteps. I tried to sleep anyway, pulling the bag tight around me, turning on my side, forcing my eyes shut. But the more I listened, the clearer it became that something or someone was walking through that graveyard. Slow steps, a pause, another step, then silence, then again but closer. The tent fabric did nothing to block sound, and every time it happened I held my breath. I didn't want to turn on the flashlight because I was afraid of what I might see through the thin nylon walls. I told myself it was all in my head, that I was psyching myself out because of where I was. But after what felt like an hour of lying there, my nerves were shot. I decided I needed to look, just once to ease my mind. I slid the zipper down as quietly as I could and poked my head out. The graveyard stretched out in front of me, rows of crooked headstones under the dim light of the half moon. The shadows were long, stretching across the ground like reaching arms. At first I didn't see anything. My eyes scanned the stones, the trees, the low wall. Nothing moved. But then, on the far end of the graveyard, I saw a figure. It wasn't a ghost or anything like that. It was a woman. She stood among the headstones, maybe 50 yards away, her back partly turned toward me. She wasn't dressed in anything unusual, just jeans and a dark jacket. But the way she stood there, perfectly still, made the hairs on my neck rise. I pulled back into the tent and froze. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I told myself maybe she was just visiting someone's grave. Maybe she had a reason to be there. But at that hour, near midnight, with no car nearby, no light but the moon, none of it made sense. Minutes dragged by. I sat in silence, waiting to hear footsteps again. But instead there was nothing. The quiet was worse than the noise. I couldn't stop picturing her standing there, unmoving, watching. I decided I couldn't stay in the tent. If she came closer, I'd be trapped. I grabbed my flashlight and my pack and unzipped the flap just enough to peek out again. The spot where I had seen her was empty now. The headstones stood alone, casting long shadows. I stepped out slowly, shining the light toward the far end of the graveyard. The beam cut across the stones, but there was no one. My skin prickled. I swung the light left, right, scanning every inch. Still nothing. Then, behind me, I heard the crunch of leaves. I spun around so fast I dropped the flashlight. It landed in the grass, beam pointing off at an angle. For a split second, I thought I saw her shape between two trees, but when I scrambled to grab the light and shined it there, the space was empty. That was enough for me. I shoved everything into my pack, ripped the tent stakes out of the ground without folding anything, and started walking toward the road. I didn't care about leaving things behind. I just wanted out. The walk back through the narrow path to the road felt endless. The beam of the flashlight shook in my hand, bouncing off tree trunks, branches, and shadows that all seemed to shift when I looked at them. My breathing grew loud in my ears, and every few steps I stopped, sure I was hearing footsteps behind me. I didn't run, though. I didn't want to. Running would mean losing control, and I knew if I started, I wouldn't stop until I collapsed. Finally, the trees thinned and I saw the faint line of the road ahead. Relief washed over me, but as I stepped onto the gravel shoulder, I turned for one last look. She was standing at the tree line, just far enough back that the shadows covered her face, but I could see the outline of her body, still motionless, the same as before. I didn't wait to see more. I walked down that road as fast as my legs would carry me, and I didn't stop until I reached the lights of a gas station a couple of miles away. I stayed inside that gas station until morning, too wired to even think about sleeping. I never went back for the tent I left behind. Whatever I lost wasn't worth stepping foot in that place again. Even now, years later, I can still picture her standing there, silent, unmoving, watching me. And the part that sticks with me the most isn't that she was in the graveyard. It's that she followed me out. I still remember the trip like it happened yesterday. It was in the summer of 2012. I was 24, and I had been traveling across parts of Eastern Europe on my own. I had saved money for almost a year to make the trip happen, and I was determined to experience everything without staying in big hotels or crowded hostels every night. I wanted quiet, raw nights in nature. One of the stops I had planned was in a forest area in northern Slovakia, not far from the Polish border. I had read about it online and seen pictures of the hiking trails and rivers that cut through the woods. Most travelers wrote about how empty it usually was, how you could hike for hours without meeting anyone. That's what attracted me to it. I took a small bus from a nearby town and got off at a stop that was basically just a patch of gravel near a dirt road. From there, I walked about 3 kilometers into the forest with my backpack and tent. The air was heavy with the smell of pine, and the ground was damp from a storm the night before. I found a spot near a river bend where the trees opened up enough to see a strip of sky above. It seemed perfect, water nearby, enough flat ground to pitch my tent, and just far enough off the trail that no one would bother me. I set up camp in the late afternoon, boiling some noodles on my small gas stove as the sun sank lower. The sound of the river and the distant calls of birds filled the air. I felt calm, like I had chosen the perfect spot. When night fell, the forest got darker than I expected. My headlamp made a narrow tunnel of light, and outside of that, it was pure black. The noises shifted too. Instead of birds, there were cracks in the brush, the croak of frogs, and the occasional splash from the river. It didn't bother me at first. I was used to being outdoors. It wasn't until around midnight, when I had been lying in my sleeping bag for an hour or so, that I heard something strange. It was different from the natural sounds of the forest. It was a distinct crunch of footsteps. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer moving along the riverbank. But the sound had a rhythm to it, slow, deliberate steps, heavy enough that it didn't match the light scurry of a fox or the uneven movement of a wild boar. These were spaced out like someone walking cautiously. I froze in my sleeping bag, my ears straining. The steps grew closer, then stopped. All I could hear was the water moving and my own heart pounding. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, maybe just my mind playing tricks. I stayed still for at least 20 minutes before drifting into a light, uneasy sleep. When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was that there were footprints in the mud not far from my tent. They weren't animal tracks. They were clearly from boots. They came from the trees, stopped maybe 15 feet from my tent, and then turned back the way they came. I crouched there staring at them with a pit in my stomach. Someone had been standing there at some point during the night, close enough to see my tent, but not close enough to leave any other sign. I tried to shake it off, telling myself maybe it was just a hiker cutting through late at night. But the fact that they stopped, watched, and then left without making themselves known made it feel different. I packed my things and spent the day hiking further upriver. The forest was thick and quiet, the kind of quiet that made you feel like you were being listened to. By late afternoon, I was tired and decided not to push further. I set up again in a new spot, this time further from the water, deeper in the trees. I told myself there was no way whoever had left those tracks could follow me this far. The second night was worse. Around the same time as the night before, I heard it again, the crunch of leaves, the snapping of a branch. Only this time it was closer, circling slowly. My tent was thin, and the nylon walls made every sound feel amplified. I lay flat, holding my breath, trying not to move. The steps stopped just outside, no more than a few meters away. I could hear someone's breathing, faint but steady. They stood there for what felt like forever, and then, without warning, there was the faint sound of something dragging along the side of my tent. My whole body tensed up. I couldn't see anything, couldn't make out a face or a figure, just the soft scrape as if someone was running their hand or a stick along the fabric. And then it was gone. No more steps, no more sound. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat with my small knife in my hand, waiting for any sign that they'd come back. When daylight came, I unzipped the tent and stepped out. There were marks in the dirt where someone had been standing. The ground was scuffed as if boots had shifted back and forth. But there were no tracks leading away that I could follow clearly. It was like they melted back into the forest. At that point, I had no interest in finishing my camping plans. I stuffed my gear into my pack and started hiking back toward the bus stop. The trails felt different now, hostile, like every shadow might hide someone watching. I kept turning to check behind me, but there was never anyone there. Still, the feeling of being followed never left. It took me nearly half a day to get back to the main road. I was exhausted, my throat dry, legs aching, but I didn't stop moving until I saw the gravel bus stop again. I sat there for almost an hour before the next bus came. While waiting, I noticed something that made my chest tighten. A cigarette, but on the ground near where I was sitting. It was fresh, still faintly warm at the tip. No one else was around. Whoever had been out there in the forest with me had made it back to the road too, probably not long before I got there. When the bus finally arrived, I climbed on without looking back. The driver barely acknowledged me, and I just sat down, clutching my pack, staring out the window. As the trees rolled by, I couldn't stop thinking about those footsteps, the breathing outside my tent, the scrape along the fabric. Whoever it was, they never tried to talk to me, never revealed themselves. They only stood there, watching, getting close enough to remind me how vulnerable I was. I never went camping alone again after that trip. Even now, years later, when I think about sleeping outdoors, I remember that sound, the slow steps circling, the heavy silence, and the knowledge that someone was out there in the dark, watching me while I lay trapped inside thin nylon walls. It wasn't a ghost or an animal. It was a person, and in some ways, that's much worse. I had been traveling through Europe in the summer of 2016, moving slowly from Germany into Austria. I had spent a few days in Salzburg, but I wanted to escape the city and camp in the countryside. I was 25 at the time, traveling alone with a backpack, a small tent, and a simple camping stove. I liked being away from crowds, away from people, just setting up camp in quiet places. I had read that the forests around Upper Austria were thick, quiet, and less touristy compared to the big alpine spots. That sounded exactly like what I wanted. I caught a train to a small town called Gmunden, then walked several miles out along country roads until the asphalt turned into gravel and then into dirt. I had no plan, only a rough idea from my map app, which I had downloaded offline before losing cell service. I remember passing through rolling fields, dotted with old barns, then climbing into dense forest as the sun lowered. The air was damp from rain the day before, and the ground smelled of wet leaves and pine. By the time I found a flat patch of ground near a clearing, it was almost evening. I set up my tent quickly, boiling water for noodles, then ate while sitting on a fallen log. Everything was silent except for birds and the occasional rustle of wind. There was no one around, not a house, not a road, just forest pressing in from every side. I crawled into my tent at dusk. The forest grew darker much faster than I expected, and soon I couldn't see anything beyond my thin nylon walls. Laying there, I felt calm at first, but like always when camping alone, the calm slowly turned into unease as the silence thickened. Every crack of a twig, every snap of a branch seemed louder in the dark. My brain couldn't stop picturing things moving just outside the tent. I tried to sleep, but sometime past midnight, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They weren't animal noises, They were slow, heavy, deliberate, like someone walking on damp leaves, pausing, then taking another step. My whole body froze. I told myself it could be a deer, but deer don't move like that. These steps were too measured, too human. I held my breath, listening, barely moving. The steps circled around the tent once, then stopped. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. After maybe a minute, I unzipped the tent just an inch and peeked outside. At first, I saw nothing, just the blur of trees against the faint moonlight. Then I saw her. She was standing about 20 feet away, between two trees, facing my tent directly. A woman, tall, with a long coat that hung down past her knees. Her hair looked gray or maybe just pale in the moonlight, and it fell straight down, covering the sides of her face. She wasn't moving. She was just standing there, watching. Every muscle in my body locked. I didn't move the zipper any further. I just stared, barely breathing. I couldn't see her face clearly, but I knew her eyes were fixed on me. It felt like she had been there for longer than I realized. Like maybe she had been watching before I even noticed. After what felt like forever, she turned slowly and walked back into the trees. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping the small camping knife I kept near my bag, my ears straining for any sound. Every crunch of leaves in the distance made me jump. I wanted to pack my things and run, but I didn't dare leave the tent until daylight. When the sun finally broke through the trees, I unzipped the tent and looked around. The forest looked normal again, like nothing had happened. No signs of anyone. I tried to convince myself that maybe I had imagined it, that maybe I was just half dreaming when I saw her. But then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. About 15 feet from my tent, in the damp dirt, there were footprints. Not boots, not hiking shoes, just plain flat shoes like old house slippers or something you wouldn't wear out in the forest. They led from the trees to my camp, circled around, and then disappeared back into the woods. I stood there staring at them, my chest tightening. I packed up as fast as I could. I didn't eat breakfast, didn't even roll my tent properly, just stuffed everything in my pack and started hiking back toward the road. I didn't look behind me. Every time I thought I heard movement in the forest, I walked faster. It took me over an hour to reach a paved road, and by then I was sweating through my shirt even though the air was cool. I walked until I found a farmhouse. An older man was working outside, and I waved from a distance. I didn't explain what I had seen. I just asked which way back to town and left it at that. When I got back to Gmunden, I sat at a cafe and tried to calm down. I kept going over the night in my head. The way she stood there, the way she didn't speak or move, just watched. I wondered if she lived somewhere out there, maybe in one of those scattered farmhouses, or if she was passing through like me. But then I thought about the slippers, the way she seemed out of place. She hadn't looked like a hiker. She hadn't even looked like she belonged in the woods. For days afterward, I couldn't shake the feeling that she had followed me. At night in my hostel room, I kept waking up and checking the window. Every time I saw a shadow move on the street, I thought of her standing outside my tent, silent, staring. I told myself she was probably just some eccentric woman wandering at night. Maybe she lived nearby, maybe she was out for a walk, maybe she was harmless. But deep down, I didn't believe that. People don't just walk into dense forest at midnight, stand silently in front of a stranger's tent, then disappear. People don't circle campsites without saying a word. I stopped wild camping alone after that. I stuck to campgrounds with other people around, and even then, I barely slept. That night in Austria never left me. I can still see her pale figure between the trees, still feel the weight of her watching me in silence. And every time I think back on it, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't woken up when I did, or if she hadn't just walked away. I had always liked the idea of camping in quiet places far away from cities. I was 24 at the time, living in Sweden in 2016, and I often went on solo trips just to get away from work and people. That summer, I chose a spot near a lake deep inside a forest outside a small town called Arvika. It wasn't an official campsite, just a flat clearing I had found on a map, far off the trails. That's what made it perfect for me. I wanted silence, no other tents, no loud families or drunk teenagers. The day I hiked in, the weather was calm, the kind of still summer air that makes every sound carry. I had a heavy pack with my small tent, sleeping bag, food, and a little gas stove. It took me nearly 2 hours to walk from where I parked my car, pushing through trees and stepping over roots until I found the clearing. The ground was soft but level, and from the edge I could see the lake shining through the trees. It was quiet enough that I could hear insects buzzing near the water. I pitched my tent near a cluster of birch trees, where the ground wasn't too damp. I unpacked slowly, putting everything where it needed to be. I collected some branches to set up a small fire pit for the night. The whole time I kept scanning the forest around me, not because I was scared, but because when you're that far in, you notice every shift in sound. The first evening was calm. I sat on a rock by the lake and ate noodles from my little pot. The water was still, like a sheet of glass, and I didn't hear anything bigger than a bird or the splash of a fish. When the sun dropped, the forest turned black fast. I climbed into my tent and lay in my sleeping bag, scrolling through my phone for a bit before turning it off. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound that wasn't the forest. It was heavy, slow steps through brush. My tent walls were thin, but sound carried sharp. I froze, listening. At first, I thought it might be a deer, but deer don't usually move that slowly, and the steps were steady, one after another, not skittish. I held my breath. They passed somewhere close to my tent, close enough that I could hear twigs snapping under weight. Then it went quiet. I lay awake for what felt like hours, staring into the dark fabric above me. My body was tense, every muscle ready to react. Eventually, exhaustion won and I slipped back into sleep. The morning light made me feel almost stupid for being so nervous. Nothing was disturbed. My pack was untouched, the fire pit was as I left it. I walked down to the lake, washed my face in the cold water, and tried to brush off the feeling. I told myself it was an animal, nothing more. The second day passed in peace. I went for a long walk along the lake shore, cooked some rice, and even dozed in the sun for a while. But as the evening stretched on, the quiet of the forest started to press in again. When the sun finally dropped and shadows took over, the trees around me felt thicker, almost like they were hiding something. That night, I woke again. This time, the sound was closer. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling. I kept still, hardly breathing. My heart hammered in my chest. Whoever or whatever it was stopped just outside the tent. I could hear weight shifting on the ground, then silence. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I lay there paralyzed. I thought about unzipping the tent, shining my flashlight, but a stronger instinct told me not to. If it was a person, I didn't want to let them know I was awake. Minutes dragged by until finally, the sound of retreating steps moved away into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed awake, listening to every creak of branches and every rustle of leaves until the first light came. When I stepped outside, my stomach dropped. About 20 feet from my tent, in the soft dirt, were footprints. Not boots, not bare feet shoes. The treads looked like running shoes pressed deep into the ground. They circled near my camp and then disappeared into the forest. My mind raced. Who the hell would be out here this deep in the middle of the night? It wasn't hunters. It wasn't hikers. People don't wander this far without a reason. I decided to pack up. I moved fast, shoving gear into my bag with shaky hands. But as I was rolling up my tent, I caught something else. A small piece of cloth, dark blue, snagged on one of the low branches just a few meters from my tent. It wasn't mine. It looked like it had been torn from a jacket. I didn't think twice anymore. I strapped everything to my back and started heading toward the direction of my car. Every step felt louder than it should. The forest was too quiet. No bird calls, no wind, just the crunch of my boots and the weight of being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but I never saw anyone. The hike back felt longer than when I came. My mouth was dry, and I could feel sweat sticking to my back under the pack. The deeper I got, the more I felt the trees closing in. At one point, I swear I heard something faint behind me, branches shifting another step, but when I stopped, it stopped too. By the time I reached the spot where I had left my car, I was nearly jogging. The car sat alone on the dirt track, just as I left it, but I didn't stop to breathe. I unlocked it fast, threw my pack inside, and slammed the doors shut. Only when the engine roared to life did I let myself look back at the tree line. There was nothing there, only the still, dark wall of forest. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was standing just inside, watching me go. I drove until the dirt road turned to asphalt, and I didn't stop until I was back in town. I booked a cheap room for the night instead of going home, because I couldn't stand the thought of being alone in the dark again. Even now, years later, I still think about it. The footprints, the torn cloth, the heavy steps outside my tent. I'll never know if it was some lost hiker, someone living in the woods, or something far worse. What I do know is this: I've never camped alone again. I remember that night like it was carved into my head with a knife. It was late September 2016. I had driven out into the woods near Lake Superior in northern Minnesota with just my gear and my old pickup. I was 27 back then, working long weeks, and camping alone was the only thing that gave me real quiet. It had rained on and off all week, and by the time I pulled my truck into a clearing off an unmarked dirt road, the sky had gone dark with heavy clouds again. I set my tent up fast before the downpour started. The ground was already soft, smelling like wet leaves and mud, and when I hammered the stakes in, they sunk deep with almost no fight. I remember the air felt heavy, almost sticky, like the whole forest was holding its breath. By the time the rain came down, I was inside my tent with a cheap headlamp, sitting on my sleeping bag, listening to it drum against the nylon above me. Started slow, just steady drops, but within minutes it was coming in sheets. The sound of rain on a tent is usually calming, but that night it felt different. It wasn't peaceful. It was loud, too loud, like the storm wanted to drown out every other sound. I cooked a simple dinner, just a can of beans heated on a little stove under the small tarp I had stretched outside. My clothes were damp, my boots were caked with mud, and the smell of wet earth clung to everything. After eating, I sat in the dark, listening. Every now and then, I could hear branches creak and snap, as if the storm was twisting the trees apart. The clearing I had picked was maybe 30 feet across, with thick woods pressing in on every side. The trees were tall pines and old birches, and even with my flashlight, the light didn't travel far. Everything outside the beam looked like a wall of shifting black. At some point around midnight, I killed the light and tried to sleep. The rain had eased up into a steady drizzle, but the ground under my sleeping pad was cold and uneven. I lay there for what felt like hours, just staring at the dim outline of the tent's ceiling. My ears picked up every little noise, the drip of water off branches, the groan of trees swaying, the occasional splash of something moving in the wet undergrowth. Then I heard it. Not rain, not branches, not an animal scurrying. It was heavy, deliberate, footsteps. At first, I told myself it had to be a deer, but the longer I lay there, the more I realized it wasn't. The steps were slow, too slow, They came in pairs like a person walking carefully. I held my breath. The sound moved along the tree line, circling the clearing. The steps would fade into the rain, then return a few seconds later, closer, then farther again. I didn't move. I didn't even unzip my bag. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might give me away. The steps stopped for a long while. I strained my ears, but all I could hear was the drizzle tapping on leaves. I almost convinced myself I had imagined it, that the storm and my nerves were playing tricks on me. That was until I heard a faint splash, just feet away, like someone had stepped into a puddle beside my tent. The hair on my neck stood up. I gripped the handle of the knife I kept tucked beside my sleeping pad. My chest was tight and my breathing shallow. I didn't dare make a sound. Minutes passed. The rain picked up again, and I still heard nothing else. Eventually, exhaustion and fear blurred together, and I must have drifted in and out of shallow sleep. When I opened my eyes again, it was early morning, gray light bleeding through the tent walls. The rain had stopped, but the air was colder, sharp against my skin. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The clearing was a mess. My tarp had collapsed under the weight of water. My small stove lay tipped over in the mud. But what froze me where I stood were the tracks. Bootprints. Clear, heavy, deep in the wet soil. They circled my tent, overlapping in places, some leading off into the woods, others coming right up to the edge of the nylon. I crouched down and touched one. It was sharp, fresh, the edges still crisp from the night's rain. I followed the prints a few yards, heart pounding harder with every step. They led straight into the tree line, then vanished into the thick brush. The ground was torn up, muddy, but there was no mistaking it. Someone had been walking circles around my camp while I lay inside that tent. I packed up fast, shoving everything into the truck bed without caring about the mud or water. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The woods were silent, too silent. No birds, no rustling, nothing but the distant drip of water off branches. As I started the engine, I looked back at the clearing one last time. The tent had left a dry outline in the grass where it had sat, surrounded by those boot prints. My stomach twisted when I realized something I hadn't noticed before. The prints weren't just circling. In two spots, they stopped completely, facing the tent, like whoever it was had stood there watching for minutes at a time. I drove out fast, tires slipping in the mud, heart still racing. I didn't stop until I hit the highway miles later. That night still sticks with me. It wasn't a ghost or some monster in the woods. It was a person, a real person, out there in the dark, walking circles around me in the rain, watching my tent while I tried to sleep. And to this day, I don't know who it was or what they wanted. All I know is I've never camped alone again. I was 32 when I went hunting deep in the Montana backcountry, fall of 2015. The air carried that sharp, cold bite that seeps through layers, and the ground was already littered with brown needles and the crunch of half-frozen leaves. I'd been planning the trip for months, mapping routes, buying gear, double-checking supplies. I wanted a quiet stretch of wilderness, far from people, where I could clear my head and focus on elk. That was the goal. I parked my truck at a rough dirt pull-off along a forgotten Forest Service road. The sun was low by the time I packed my rifle, tent, food, and the rest of the gear onto my back. I hiked about 4 miles in, through narrow ridges and tangled pines, until the road was long out of sight. The woods grew silent the deeper I went, except for the occasional scatter of birds and the faraway rush of wind against the tree line. Felt like the right spot to set up camp. I found a small clearing near a thin stream, enough flat ground for my tent, and water close by. The first night was calm. I cooked beans from a can, sat by the small fire, and listened to the creek gurgle. felt good to be alone. No phone signal, no headlights, no people. Just me and the cold air. I fell asleep to the sound of distant coyotes yipping across the valley. The second day, I hunted from dawn until dusk. I tracked sign, scattered droppings, tracks pressed into soft earth, claw marks on trees where elk had rubbed velvet. I never saw anything bigger than a rabbit. Still, it was fine. Hunting's more waiting than shooting. I was more focused on moving slowly, making no sound, paying attention. By the time I returned to camp, the light was almost gone. I made a small fire again, heated some jerky and rice, and tried to relax. But something felt different that night. The forest had gone strangely quiet. No coyotes, no night birds, just the crackle of my fire and the stream. Sometime past midnight, I woke up in the tent. At first I thought it was the wind, but then I realized I was hearing soft crunches, slow steps on the frozen ground. I held my breath. The sound circled around my camp. It wasn't heavy like a bear, and it wasn't the light scurry of a raccoon either. It was steady, deliberate, human. I stayed still, gripping the knife I kept inside the tent. My rifle leaned against a tree just outside, which made my stomach drop. I didn't unzip the tent, didn't move, just listened. The steps circled twice, then faded into the trees. I lay awake until morning, heart hammering, every sound magnified. The next day I checked the ground. The dirt was hard, but I found impressions, boot prints. Not old, not weathered. Someone had been walking around my tent at night. They weren't mine. I felt uneasy but tried to brush it off. Maybe a hiker, maybe another hunter. It wasn't private land after all. Still, the way they'd walked circles around my camp left a pit in my gut. I decided to move farther in. I packed up everything and hiked deeper into the timber, another 3 or 4 miles. The terrain grew rougher. Steep inclines, patches of snow, dense spruce thickets where light barely reached. I found another clearing, smaller than the first, and set camp again. The third night, it happened again. Around 1 or 2 in the morning, I woke to the sound of movement. This time I unzipped the tent slowly, just an inch, enough to peek out. The fire had burned down to embers, and the moon threw pale light across the clearing. That's when I saw him. A man, tall, wearing dark clothing, standing just beyond the edge of my camp. Not moving, just standing there. His face was hidden in shadow, but I could see the shape of him. Broad shoulders, still as stone, watching. My chest felt tight. I didn't move, didn't breathe. After what felt like minutes, he turned and walked back into the trees. Quiet, controlled, like he'd done it before. I didn't sleep again that night. As soon as dawn broke, I packed everything in a rush. I told myself I'd had enough, that I'd hike back to the truck and call it off. No elk was worth this, but the forest seemed to close in on me as I hiked out. Every sound behind me made me glance over my shoulder. Every shadow looked like a figure. I kept a tight grip on my rifle, safety off, eyes scanning constantly. By late afternoon, I realized something was wrong. I should have been close to the service road, but the trees all looked the same, and the ridges didn't match my map anymore. I must have veered off my original path in my rush to get out. My compass pointed west, but the ground forced me into detours. Steep ravines, deadfall tangles, icy streams. As the sun dropped, the cold sharpened. My legs ached. My shoulders burned under the weight of my pack, and panic scratched at the edges of my thoughts. I set up camp again, exhausted and disoriented, planning to reorient in the morning. That night, he came closer. I woke to the snap of a branch, louder than before. I froze, listening. Then I heard breathing. Not mine. Heavy, steady, just outside the thin wall of my tent. My skin went cold. I grabbed the rifle, cocked it, and aimed toward the sound even though I couldn't see through the canvas. The breathing stopped. For a long time, there was nothing. just silence and my own pulse roaring in my ears. Finally, footsteps retreated into the trees. I didn't sleep again. I sat up with the rifle across my knees until the first gray light of morning seeped through. I started hiking again, pushing hard, no rest breaks. My only thought was getting out. The prints were everywhere now. Fresh boot tracks in the dirt, pressed into patches of snow, sometimes only yards behind mine. He was following me. By midday, I reached a ridge that gave me a view of the valley below. My stomach dropped. I could see the faint line of the service road in the distance, but it was still miles away, across rough terrain. Too far to reach before dark. I forced myself down the ridge anyway, slipping, stumbling, cutting my hands on sharp rock. My pack felt like it weighed 100 pounds, but I didn't dare stop. The whole way down I felt eyes on me, like he was just out of sight, pacing me through the trees. The sun dipped again, shadows stretching long. My legs shook with exhaustion. I finally stopped in a thicket, dropped my pack, and leaned against a tree, trying to catch my breath. That's when I saw him again. Through the branches, maybe 50 yards away. Standing, watching, not moving. His face still hidden, but I could feel his eyes on me. I raised the rifle, aimed right at him. My hands trembled so bad the barrel wavered. He didn't flinch. He just stood there. After a long moment, he stepped back into the trees and vanished. I don't know how I made it the rest of the way. I hiked through the night, stumbling, tripping, every snap of a twig making me spin around with the rifle raised. My body was running on pure fear. By the time the sky began to lighten, I saw the glint of metal through the trees. My truck. Relief hit so hard I almost collapsed. I broke into a run, dropped my pack, and scrambled inside. The instant the doors locked, I felt like I could breathe again. I drove without stopping until I hit the highway. My hands wouldn't stop shaking on the wheel. I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see him on the road behind me. I never went back to that forest. Never hunted alone again. I don't know who he was or why he followed me, but I know what I saw, and I know if I hadn't left when I did, if I'd stayed one more night out there, he would have done more than just watch. I had been traveling alone through Austria in the summer of 2016, trying to see as much of the countryside as I could on a tight budget. I was 27 at the time, and instead of paying for hotels, I carried a tent and camped out in different spots. It gave me freedom, and I liked the quiet. I had already spent a few nights near small lakes and hiking trails, and everything had gone smoothly. One late afternoon, after walking most of the day with my backpack, I ended up on a trail leading down into a valley. The path curved through tall pine trees, and the ground was damp from rain the night before. My legs were sore, and I decided I'd stop for the night instead of pushing further. I noticed a small clearing about 50 yards off the trail. It looked flat, the grass wasn't too thick, and it was tucked between trees so it wasn't completely exposed. It seemed like a good place to set up my tent. I dropped my pack and went about unpacking. I laid out my small tent, set up the poles, and staked it down. It didn't take long, maybe 15 minutes, but while I was crouched hammering one of the stakes into the dirt, I felt the back of my neck tighten, like when someone is watching you. I paused and turned around slowly. The trees swayed, the branches creaked, and the forest felt still, but I didn't see anyone. I told myself it was just the silence getting to me. After the tent was ready, I gathered a bit of dry wood I could find nearby and set a small fire inside a ring of stones someone had built before me. That made me feel more comfortable, like I wasn't the first person who had camped there. I cooked a simple meal from the supplies in my pack, noodles and some bread. I ate, watched the fire burn, and felt the fatigue of the day pull at me. As the light began to fade, the valley darkened quickly. The forest grew heavy with shadows, and the sound of insects and distant birds faded. I put out the fire, packed my food tightly to keep away animals, and slid into my tent. I lay on my sleeping bag, listening to the faint drip of water from the trees above. I almost fell asleep, but then I heard something else. It was the crunch of footsteps on leaves. Slow, steady, deliberate. Not the light scatter of an animal, but the sound of a boot pressing into damp ground. I froze, every muscle in my body tight. My tent was thin nylon, barely a barrier between me and the outside. I lay there, holding my breath, trying not to make a sound. The footsteps moved closer. I could hear them circling. The sound was faint at first, then heavier, like someone dragging their weight carefully, trying not to draw attention. They stopped near the fire pit. I could almost picture someone standing there, looking at the remains of my small fire, realizing someone was here alone. I didn't move. I didn't even unzip my sleeping bag. Minutes passed. I thought maybe I had imagined it, but then I heard the sound again, this time right outside the tent. Leaves shifted, twigs cracked. Whoever it was, they were less than 3 feet from where I lay. I stared at the thin fabric wall, praying I wouldn't see a shadow pass across it. My heart hammered so loud I thought it would give me away. Then there was silence. Long, empty silence. I didn't hear footsteps leaving, and I didn't hear anything else. I lay there for what felt like hours, until finally exhaustion overpowered fear and I drifted into shallow, broken sleep. When I woke up, the sun was just breaking through the trees. For a moment, I convinced myself it had been a dream, a trick of my tired mind. I stepped outside, stretched, and looked around. That's when I saw the footprints. In the soft ground around my camp, there were impressions of heavy boots. They weren't mine. I had been wearing lighter hiking shoes, and the treads didn't match. The prints circled my tent, stopped at the fire pit, then came back to the tent again. At one point, they stopped directly at the entrance, just inches from where my head had been. I felt my stomach twist. Whoever it was hadn't said a word, hadn't tried to make themselves known. They had just walked around and stood there in the dark, watching. I packed my things as fast as I could. I didn't even bother with breakfast. My hands shook as I shoved my tent back into my pack, not folding it properly, just cramming it in. I kept scanning the trees, expecting to see someone standing there, waiting. As I got back to the trail, I noticed something else. Off to the side, where the underbrush thinned out, there was a makeshift shelter. Branches leaned against a large rock, forming a crude wall. Inside, I saw a pile of blankets, an old backpack, and empty bottles. It wasn't abandoned. It looked like someone had been living there, and it wasn't more than 100 yards from where I had camped. My chest tightened as the realization sank in. That person had been watching me from the woods, close enough to see me set up camp, make a fire, and go to bed. I had walked right into their backyard without knowing it. I didn't stay to look any longer. I kept moving up the trail, pushing myself hard, not stopping for miles. Every snap of a branch behind me made me spin around, but the path stayed empty. By midday, I reached a small village. I went straight to the first cafe I saw and sat there for hours, just letting myself breathe again. That night, I paid for a cheap room instead of camping. Lying in a bed with 4 solid walls felt like a luxury. I thought about how close it had been, how thin the line was between being safe and being in real danger. I never camped alone in Austria again after that. Whenever I traveled later, I stuck to official campgrounds or hostels. I told myself it was just one strange encounter, but the thought of someone circling my tent in silence while I lay helpless inside still crawls under my skin to this day. It wasn't a ghost story, it wasn't some campfire tale, it was a real person. And that's what made it terrifying. I set out to camp with my dog in the summer of 2017 in the northern woods of Montana. I was 27 then, restless and tired of city noise, thinking that a few nights in the quiet would clear my head. My dog, a 2-year-old German Shepherd named Rex, was my only company. I loaded up the truck with the tent, a sleeping bag, some food, and enough water. The drive to the spot I had picked, an old logging road that wasn't used anymore, was long and rough. The trees grew thicker the deeper I went, the sound of the tires crunching gravel echoing in the empty woods. When I finally parked, the sun was hanging low, bleeding orange through the tops of the pines. The air smelled like sap and damp dirt. I shouldered my pack, Rex trotting ahead, excited to be out in the open. I picked a small clearing about 100 yards off the road and set up camp there. The grass was knee-high and the ground was uneven, but it was far enough from the road to feel private. The first evening went smooth. I pitched the tent, started a small fire, and heated up some canned chili while Rex sniffed the edge of the clearing. The night settled in quickly, with the woods falling dead silent except for the occasional crack of branches in the distance. I sat by the fire until the flames turned to glowing coals, then crawled into the tent with Rex curled at my feet. Sleep came easy that night, the kind of heavy, dreamless sleep that comes after a long day outdoors. The second day was hotter. The sun was sharp, the air sticky, and the mosquitoes were relentless. I hiked a bit with Rex in the morning, following a narrow game trail that wound through the trees, but the heat drove us back to camp by midday. I spent the afternoon lazing around, reading a paperback, swatting bugs, and occasionally tossing a stick for Rex. The peace of it made me forget the world outside the woods. It was only when dusk came again that things started to shift. As the light faded, Rex grew restless. He kept lifting his head, ears pinned, staring off toward the trees on the north side of camp. At first I thought maybe he smelled a deer or a bear, but his growl was low, constant, unlike when he was just curious. It unsettled me. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. The tent was stifling, the nylon walls damp with condensation. Rex was sitting upright, ears perked, staring at the thin fabric of the tent wall. He didn't bark, he just growled under his breath. My stomach knotted. I held still, listening. The woods outside were not silent. There was a faint crunch of leaves, deliberate, slow, like footsteps circling the clearing. I froze. My mind scrambled through explanations. A bear, maybe a moose, but the steps were too measured, too light. My heart pounded so hard I could hear the blood in my ears. Rex's growl deepened, his body rigid. I didn't move. Whoever or whatever it was out there stopped after a while, and the woods went silent again. I stayed awake until the first gray light of morning crept in. The next day, I considered packing up, but I convinced myself I was just being jumpy. Maybe it had been a deer. Maybe the woods were playing tricks on my mind. I didn't want to cut the trip short over something small, but I couldn't shake the unease. I went about the day trying to ignore it. I fetched water from a creek a half-mile away, cooked oatmeal, threw a stick for Rex, but every little sound made me tense. When night came again, I made the fire bigger, feeding it more wood than I needed, trying to keep the shadows away. Rex stayed close, rarely leaving my side. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again. The crunch of leaves, heavier this time, closer. My pulse raced. I slowly unzipped the tent just enough to peer out. The fire had burned low, only glowing embers left. The woods beyond the circle of light were pure black. At first, I didn't see anything. Then, between two trees, I caught it. A dark shape, tall, motionless, just standing there. I blinked, thinking maybe my eyes were playing tricks, but Rex lunged forward, barking violently, the kind of bark that was raw and dangerous. The shape moved. It didn't run like an animal. It stepped back, smooth, like a man retreating into the shadows. My blood went cold. I yanked Rex back into the tent, zipped it shut, and grabbed the hatchet I kept near my bag. I sat there all night, every nerve on edge, until dawn broke. That morning, I was done pretending. I packed my gear fast, hands shaking, constantly scanning the tree line. Rex wouldn't stop pacing, hackles up, eyes darting. I threw everything into the truck without much care and started down the dirt road. A few miles down, I slowed when I saw something on the roadside. At first, I thought it was trash, but as I got closer, my stomach dropped. It was a pair of worn-out boots, placed side by side, neat, in the middle of the gravel road. No car, no pack, no person. Just boots. I didn't stop. I pressed the gas harder, every hair on my body standing up. My hands gripped the wheel so tight my knuckles went white. Rex whined from the passenger seat, restless. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone walking down the road after me. But the mirror stayed empty, just dust rising behind the truck. When I finally reached the highway, I pulled over at a gas station. Only then did I let out the breath I had been holding. I sat there, sweaty, exhausted, my nerves wrecked. I looked at Rex, his ears still twitching, eyes still alert. He hadn't imagined it. Neither had I. I never went back to that spot again. In fact, I stopped camping alone altogether. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there in the woods those nights. But I do know this, it wasn't an animal. The way it moved, the way it stood silent and deliberate, it was human. Someone had been watching us, circling the camp, waiting in the dark. And I was glad I left when I did, because I can't help but think that if I had stayed one more night, I might not have made it out at all. I was 23 when I decided to spend a long weekend camping alone in northern Idaho. It was late September of 2014. The weather was cooling off, but still good enough to be out without freezing at night. I had a small tent, a sleeping bag, a cheap propane stove, and enough food for 4 days. I wanted to get away from noise, from people, from my phone, and just be outside. I had grown up hiking and fishing with my dad, so I wasn't exactly inexperienced, but this was my first time going deep into the woods completely alone. I parked my car off a dirt road that looked barely used, about an hour outside of Sandpoint. From there, I hiked with my pack down an old trail that led into the timber. The trees grew thick, tall pines and spruces, their needles blanketing the ground. I walked for almost 3 hours before I found a good flat spot near a stream. The water was clear and fast enough that I knew I wouldn't need to worry about it being stagnant. I set my tent up just far enough from the bank to avoid moisture, but close enough that I could hear the running water when I lay down at night. The first day went smooth. I set up camp, collected firewood, boiled some water for coffee, and watched the sun go down behind the treeline. The air got colder fast, and by the time I climbed into my sleeping bag, I had to keep my hat on. I drifted off to the sound of the stream and the crackle of the last bits of fire. The second day I spent hiking around, exploring. I followed the stream north for about a mile and found old signs of logging, rusty cable, a few rotting stumps cut flat, and the skeleton of what might have been a truck, sunk halfway into the earth. It made me feel even more isolated. The silence out there was heavy. No distant cars, no airplanes overhead, not even the sound of dogs barking like you hear in small towns. Just wind moving through trees and the occasional call of a bird. That night, I built another fire, cooked a simple dinner, and sat for hours watching the flames eat through the wood. The forest was pitch black beyond the glow of the fire, and every little crack or rustle sounded sharper when it came from that darkness. I told myself it was deer or maybe a raccoon, but I kept catching myself looking over my shoulder. Around midnight, I killed the fire and crawled into my tent. I had just started drifting off when I heard something crunching in the leaves not too far away. My body went stiff instantly. It wasn't quick movement like a rabbit. It was slow, deliberate steps. I held my breath and listened. The steps came closer, then paused. I was lying there, staring at the thin fabric of my tent wall, my mind racing. After maybe a minute, the steps moved again, this time circling slowly around. I couldn't see anything, but the sound was clear enough that I could tell it wasn't small. My chest felt tight. After what felt like forever, the sound faded into the distance. I lay awake for hours, too afraid to move, until exhaustion pulled me under. The third day, I was on edge. I tried to convince myself it had been a deer, maybe an elk. They could make noises like that, but something about the pattern, the slowness of the steps, didn't fit. I distracted myself by hiking again, keeping my pocket knife in my jacket. When I returned to camp in the late afternoon, I noticed something that set my nerves off again. A stick that I had used to prop up a small tarp over my cooking area had been knocked down. It wasn't windy that day, and I had jammed it into the ground pretty firm. I stared at it for a long time before picking it back up and resetting it. That night, I made the fire bigger, feeding it constantly, keeping it alive until past 2 in the morning. My logic was simple: animals avoided fire. And if it wasn't an animal, well, fire still made me feel less exposed. Finally, when I couldn't keep my eyes open, I let it die down and went into the tent. The sound came back. This time, I didn't hear slow steps at first. Instead, I woke to the sound of water splashing at the stream, like someone wading through it. My mouth went dry. I sat upright, clutching my knife, straining my ears. The splashing stopped, followed by the same slow crunching in the leaves. Whatever it was, it came right up near my tent. I could hear breathing now, not animal panting, but steady, controlled breaths. My skin prickled all over. I didn't move a muscle. I didn't even breathe deeply, just sat there waiting, praying. The breathing lingered, then faded again. The steps moved away, further and further, until I couldn't hear them anymore. By sunrise, I knew I couldn't stay another night. I boiled water, stuffed everything into my pack as fast as I could, and kicked dirt over the fire pit. I kept looking into the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there watching me. The forest felt different that morning, heavier, like it wanted me gone. I hiked fast, barely stopping to drink. My shoulders ached from the weight of my pack, but adrenaline kept me going. Every sound made me whip my head around. At one point, I could swear I saw movement ahead on the trail, just a flicker of something slipping behind a tree. I froze, heart pounding, but when I stared long enough, nothing came out. I pushed forward harder. By the time I finally reached my car, my legs were trembling from exhaustion. The relief of unlocking the door and throwing my pack into the back seat almost made me cry. I slid behind the wheel, started the engine, and drove without stopping until I hit paved road. That night, back home, I couldn't shake it. I replayed the sounds, the breathing, the circling steps. Maybe it had been a hunter, maybe some guy living out in the woods, maybe just someone messing with me. But the deliberate way it moved around my tent, the fact it came back multiple nights, told me it wasn't random. Someone knew I was alone out there. I didn't tell anyone at first, because part of me felt stupid. I hadn't seen anything with my own eyes, hadn't spoken to anyone. But the more I thought about it, the more certain I became that whoever it was, they weren't just passing through. They had been watching me. They wanted me to know I wasn't really alone. That was the last time I ever camped alone. I still go with friends sometimes, but I can't relax the same way I used to. Every crack in the woods makes me tense up. Every time the firelight fades, I remember lying there in my tent, too scared to breathe, listening to those slow footsteps circle me in the dark. And what unsettles me the most isn't what I heard. It's that I left before finding out what would have happened if I hadn't. I was 22 years old in the summer of 1998 when I decided to take a week-long trip into the Ouachita Mountains in Arkansas. I had been camping since I was a kid, and I always liked doing it alone. My friends thought I was strange for wanting that kind of silence, but I enjoyed the feeling of being completely cut off. No phones, no noise from the town, just me, the woods, and the sound of my boots on dirt. I picked a spot about 3 miles off a service road, near a slow creek where the water was clear enough to drink after filtering. I carried my old canvas tent, a sleeping bag, some dried food, and a small stove. The air was hot during the day, sticky almost, but at night the cool breeze moved through the trees and made it feel like another place entirely. The woods were thick, endless pines and oaks, and the ground was scattered with leaves that cracked under every step. The first 2 days were calm. I hiked during daylight, cooked simple meals, and wrote in a notebook I always carried. At night, I listened to crickets and the low hum of cicadas, with the occasional rustle of something moving through the brush. Most of the time it was deer. I saw their tracks in the mud near the creek and heard them in the distance, heavy bodies breaking branches as they moved. On the third night, just after I'd finished eating, I heard something different. It wasn't the usual quick scurry of a raccoon or the hooves of a deer. This was slower, heavier. Something stepped down on the twigs and didn't rush away. It sounded careful. I was sitting by the dim glow of my small fire, and the sound came from the dark tree line behind me. I turned my head and just listened. The steps would move a little, then stop, then shift again. It felt like whoever or whatever it was didn't want me to know it was there. I sat still for 10 minutes, staring at the black space between the trees, but I saw nothing. Finally, I told myself it was maybe a stray dog or even a black bear, though the sound didn't fit right. Bears crash through, they don't sneak. I went into my tent, zipped it shut, and tried to sleep. The crunching outside faded after a while, and I drifted off. The next morning, I walked around the edges of my campsite. I didn't see any paw prints or animal tracks. The ground was a little hard, but I thought I would have at least seen something pressed into the dirt. Still, I brushed it off. That afternoon, I hiked farther upriver. The woods were dense, and the heat felt heavier the deeper I went. By the time I came back to camp, the sun was setting orange over the ridge. I cooked some rice and jerky, ate slowly, then leaned back against a log. That's when I saw something odd about 50 yards out. Through the trees, I spotted what looked like a piece of fabric caught on a branch. It was too clean to be natural. I got up and walked closer. When I reached it, I realized it wasn't fabric at all. It was a ripped sleeve from a flannel shirt, dark red, frayed at the edges like it had been torn off by force. It was stuck on a low branch, swaying slightly. My stomach tightened. It didn't look old either. The color hadn't faded yet. I stood there staring at it for a while, the woods suddenly too quiet around me. No birds, no insects, just stillness. I pulled the sleeve free and dropped it on the ground. I didn't like the idea of someone else being out here. That night, I could not relax. The fire was small, barely lighting the clearing, and the trees felt like they were pressing in closer. Around midnight, I heard the steps again. This time, they circled, slow crunching on leaves, moving in a wide loop around my tent. My heart pounded in my chest. I grabbed the hunting knife I kept by my side and sat up, staring at the fabric walls of the tent, trying to figure out how many feet there were. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like boots. The steps would stop for long stretches, long enough that I almost convinced myself I'd imagined them. But then a branch would snap again, closer than before. At one point, I heard the soft sound of breathing outside the tent flap. Not a snort, not an animal's breath, just someone standing there, calm and patient. I gripped the knife until my hand cramped. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. When morning finally came, I crawled out, eyes burning from staying awake. My fire had burned down to ash. The ground near the tent looked disturbed, as if someone had been walking in circles all night. I didn't find any shoe prints, but the leaves were pressed flat in places they hadn't been the day before. I thought about packing up and heading out, but I was miles in and stubborn. I told myself maybe it was my imagination mixed with fatigue. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. That evening, I decided not to light a fire. I didn't want to draw attention if someone really was out there. I ate a cold meal in the fading light and then crawled into my tent. I kept my knife in one hand and a flashlight in the other. For hours, I lay still, listening. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. The crunch of leaves, closer this time, then silence, then a new sound, something metallic brushing against metal. I froze. My pack was outside the tent, with a small pot and utensils hanging from it. Whatever it was had touched them. My mouth went dry. I didn't move. Then, after what felt like forever, the sound of footsteps retreated. They didn't run. They just walked slowly back into the woods until I couldn't hear them anymore. At first light, I made my decision. I packed everything as fast as I could, barely folding my tent, just shoving it in the bag. My nerves were shot. As I started the hike back to the service road, I kept glancing behind me. The forest felt alive in a way it hadn't before, like eyes were following me through the trees. Halfway back, I stopped for water at the creek. That's when I noticed it. In the mud at the edge of the bank, there were prints. Not animal, boots. The tread was clear, deep, and fresh. And the strangest part was that the prints followed mine from the day before. Step for step, my chest tightened. Someone had been following me through the woods, close enough to track every place I had been. I filled my bottle quickly, then started moving again, almost jogging despite the weight of my pack. When I finally reached the service road, the relief hit me like a wave. I walked straight back to my truck, threw my gear in, and left without looking back. I didn't stop driving until I was hours away. Even now, years later, I still think about that trip. I never went camping alone again. It wasn't the woods that scared me. It was knowing there had been someone out there, watching me, circling me, waiting in the dark for reasons I'll never understand. That thought alone is enough to keep me out of the deep woods forever. I was 21 years old the summer I decided to spend a week camping alone in northern Arizona. It was late June of 2014, right after I had finished my college finals, and I wanted nothing more than to get away from noise, stress, and people. I had grown up in a small town in New Mexico, so being outdoors never scared me. I thought I was comfortable with silence, with forests, with the night. I thought I knew what to expect. I drove my old pickup out toward the Coconino National Forest, an area I had only been to a few times before. I brought my tent, a sleeping bag, a cooler with food and water, a hunting knife, a small propane stove, and a flashlight with spare batteries. I wasn't there to hunt or fish, just to be away from people and to see if I could handle a week by myself. The spot I picked wasn't by the official campground. I parked down a dirt road and hiked in for almost an hour until I found a flat clearing with pine trees thick all around it. Felt quiet, private, safe. The first 2 days went smoothly. I woke with the sun, made coffee on my little stove, and spent hours hiking trails, reading and writing in a small notebook. At night, I made a fire, cooked simple meals, and lay back staring at the stars until I got tired. It was exactly what I wanted, peace and space. On the third evening, though, things started to shift. It was around sunset when I noticed how strangely quiet the woods felt. Normally, I could hear insects buzzing, the wind through branches, sometimes even coyotes in the distance. But that night, everything seemed heavy, like the air itself had weight. I brushed it off, telling myself I was just too used to city noise. As the fire burned low, I heard something move out in the trees. It wasn't far, maybe 30 yards out. It sounded heavy, like a person walking, but the steps were uneven, dragging. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. Then it stopped. I waited, my ears straining, but the sound didn't come back. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just an elk or maybe a deer and went into my tent. I woke up sometime after midnight to the sound of movement again. This time it was closer, circling the tent slowly. My heart pounded in my chest as I held my breath and tried not to make a sound. Whatever it was on 2 legs. I could hear the weight shift, one step at a time, crunching softly against the pine needles. I gripped the knife under my pillow so tight my hand hurt. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the footsteps stopped. I lay there for hours, barely blinking, until the faint blue light of morning came through the tent walls. The next day, I thought hard about packing up and leaving, but pride kept me there. I didn't want to admit I had gotten scared over nothing. I stayed, telling myself it was just an animal, maybe even another camper wandering through the woods. Still, I carried my knife everywhere that day. That evening, I collected extra wood and built my fire bigger than usual. The light made me feel better, but it also made me uneasy because if anyone or anything was out there, they could see exactly where I was. It was around 10 when I heard it again. This time, it wasn't footsteps. It was a sound that made my stomach twist. It was a voice. My own name called from somewhere in the trees. Slow, stretched, like someone testing the sound of it. I dropped the stick I had been holding and stared into the darkness, the fire snapping behind me. The voice came again, a little closer, calling my name in the exact tone my younger brother used to use. Except my brother was hundreds of miles away. I didn't move. I didn't answer. I just stood there, frozen, trying not to breathe too loud. The voice stopped after a few minutes, but I could hear faint rustling as if something had moved off into the trees. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Every little sound outside the tent made my body tense. Around 3 in the morning, I thought I heard scratching against the tent fabric. Just light, almost like a fingernail running down it. I gripped my knife again, waiting for the tent to tear open, but it never did. Eventually, dawn came, and I stumbled out with bloodshot eyes and shaky hands. I should have left that morning, but I stayed one more night. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was stupidity. I told myself I was imagining things. That last night is something I will never forget. I kept the fire blazing, higher than before. The woods stayed dead quiet. No wind, no bugs, nothing. Around midnight, I heard movement again, but this time it wasn't careful. It was fast, circling me in bursts, stopping, starting again, like it was testing me. My stomach turned to stone. Then, from the tree-line, something stepped into the firelight. For half a second, I thought it was a person, but my brain told me instantly it wasn't right. The shape was tall, almost too tall, its arms hanging lower than they should. The face looked blurred in the light, like it wasn't formed all the way, and the way it stood made every hair on my body rise. It didn't come closer. It just stood there, swaying a little, watching me. My name slipped out of its mouth again, almost perfectly this time, but just slightly off, like someone who had only practiced saying it a few times. My chest tightened, and I thought I was going to throw up. I didn't wait. I grabbed my flashlight, my knife, and my keys, and I ran. I left everything else, tent, cooler, food, scattered behind me. I didn't look back to see if it followed. I just tore through the trees until I saw the faint outline of the dirt road and my truck parked at the end. My lungs were burning by the time I reached it. I fumbled the keys, yanked the door open, and floored the gas so hard the tires spun in the dirt. I didn't stop driving until I hit the highway and saw lights from a gas station an hour away. I sat in the parking lot shaking, my hands gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles were white. I stayed there until the sun came up, trying to convince myself I was safe. When I finally went back a week later with a friend to pick up my gear, the tent was slashed open down the side, the cooler tipped, everything scattered. My friend said it was probably animals. I didn't argue. I didn't tell him what I saw. I haven't camped alone since. I still hike, I still love the woods, but when the sun goes down, I leave. I don't care if it makes me look weak. That night taught me there are things out there that wear the shape of people, that learn our names, our voices, and wait for us to be stupid enough to listen. And I'll never give it that chance again. I was 23 years old the first time I decided to camp alone. It was the summer of 2014, and I had just moved to Washington State for work. I didn't know many people there yet, and weekends felt long and empty. I had always loved hiking, so I figured spending a night alone in the woods might be a good way to reset my mind. It sounded peaceful when I planned it. I chose a spot in the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest, not far from a small lake I'd seen on a map. The drive from Seattle was about 3 hours, and by the time I parked my car at the trailhead, the afternoon sun was already sliding behind the trees. My backpack felt heavier than it should have, even though I had only packed the basics: tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, a flashlight, a knife, and enough food for 2 days. The trail was quiet except for the crunch of my boots on the dirt. Tall pines rose on both sides of me, their branches blocking most of the sky. The air smelled sharp and damp, a mix of moss and pine needles. I passed no one on the way in. It felt like I had the entire forest to myself, which was exactly what I thought I wanted. After about 2 hours of walking, I reached the lake. It was smaller than I imagined, more of a pond, ringed by trees with a narrow stretch of rocky shore on one side. The water was still, reflecting the darkening sky like a mirror. I picked a spot a few yards from the shore to set up my tent. By the time I finished, the light had faded into that gray-blue dimness that only lasts a short while before night falls completely. I boiled water for noodles on my little stove and sat on a rock while eating. The forest around me was still and heavy, with only the occasional rustle of leaves. I kept expecting to hear frogs or birds, but there was almost nothing. The quiet made every small sound stand out. A branch snapping somewhere behind me, the faint splash of something in the water. Each time I looked around, I saw nothing but trees. When the last bit of light drained from the sky, I crawled into my tent. I left the rainfly off so I could see the trees silhouetted against the stars. For a while, I lay on my back, listening. The silence pressed down on me in a way that felt unnatural. I realized how far I was from the trailhead, how far from anyone else. My phone had lost signal hours earlier. If something happened, no one would know. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a sound. It was faint at first, a crunching on the ground, the kind of noise someone makes when walking slowly across leaves and twigs. I held my breath and strained to listen. The sound came again, deliberate, steady, moving closer. I told myself it had to be an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon, but the steps were too measured, too heavy. I turned on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the mesh of my tent. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might echo outside. I didn't see anything, only the pale shapes of tree trunks. The sound stopped. I waited, holding the light, barely breathing. After a long time, I convinced myself it was nothing and turned the flashlight off. I couldn't fall back asleep. I lay there, eyes open, listening to the forest. Hours dragged by. Every small noise set me on edge. The creak of a branch, the distant splash of water. At one point, I thought I heard something brushing against my tent, a faint scrape along the fabric, But when I sat up and shone the flashlight, nothing moved. When the first light of dawn seeped into the trees, I unzipped the tent and stepped out. The air was cold and damp. I checked the ground around my camp, and that's when I saw it. About 20 feet from my tent, in the soft dirt near the edge of the lake, there were footprints. Not boot prints, bare feet. They were large, the toes clearly outlined, the heels pressed deep into the soil. I froze, staring at them. They led out of the trees, stopped a short distance from my tent, and then turned back into the forest. I felt my stomach twist. Someone had been there, walking barefoot through the woods in the middle of the night. I wanted to pack up immediately, but I forced myself to eat a quick breakfast first. My hands shook as I tried to light the stove. Every few seconds I glanced toward the trees, half expecting someone to step out and watch me. I couldn't shake the image of those prints, the thought of someone standing there in the dark, just looking at my tent while I slept. By the time I finished eating, I had made up my mind. I wasn't staying another night. I stuffed my gear back into my pack as fast as I could, collapsed the tent, and slung everything over my shoulders. The trail back felt different in daylight. Every tree looked suspicious. Every shadow seemed like it might hide someone. I kept turning around, convinced I was being followed, but I never saw anyone. The hike out took less time, maybe because I was practically rushing. My shirt clung to my back with sweat despite the cool morning air. When I finally reached the trailhead and saw my car, a wave of relief hit me so hard I almost laughed. But the relief didn't last long. As I got closer, I noticed something wrong. On the driver's side door, smeared across the glass, was a handprint. It was faint, greasy, like someone had pressed their bare hand against the window. The fingers were long, and I could see the smudge of each one stretched across the glass. I unlocked the car and threw my pack in, my eyes darting around the empty lot. Not a single other vehicle was there. I climbed into the driver's seat and slammed the door. My hands shook as I started the engine. I drove the entire way back to Seattle without stopping. The whole time, I couldn't shake the thought that someone had followed me through the woods, maybe even watched me while I slept. The handprint on my car window burned in my mind. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see another vehicle tailing me. When I got home, I sat in the car for a long time before I went inside. The handprint was still there, faint in the daylight but visible enough. I thought about wiping it off, but I didn't. I just left it like some kind of warning. I never went camping alone again after that. Even now, years later, I think about that night whenever I see a quiet forest or a still body of water. The woods are beautiful, but they're not empty. Someone else can always be out there, and sometimes they're closer than you think.